Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today's topic is going to be, who is the boss, the church or the state? Now, dealing with all of the New World Order and revolutionary politics, the number one issue always comes down to authority. Who is the ultimate authority? And you could even say, beyond church versus state, which are merely representatives, is it God or is it man? And really every schism in church history has always had to do with authority. Now let's go back to the Gospels for a second. Jesus told his apostles that you are not in the kingdom of God. It is not like the Gentiles rule, lording over others. Authority in the Christian sense it exists for the purpose of serving those over whom the authority has. So the authority exists to serve. Authority is not self-serving, right? And it has to be under charity and under love, loving the other. That goes for households. The wife and the children submit to the husband and father, but the husband and the father has to love the wife as Christ loved the church, which means he has to deny himself and lay his life down. And that's how all authorities are to be, right? Christ gave Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever he shall bind will be bound in heaven, whatever he shall loose shall be loosed in heaven. And he says to Peter, feed my sheep, feed my flock. So that Peter, as the chief of the apostles, his responsibility in his authority is to serve, which is why his successors, the popes, are called the servants of God. And every issue and schism in church history has had to do with authority. Who has it? Right? So, you can make the case that, and in addition to that, let me backtrack. The Pope does not have unilateral authority as a prophet or a oracle. He's bound to the deposit of faith given once and for all to the apostles. He's bound to his predecessors. He's bound to church law and church dogma. He cannot make up new dogmas, new doctrines. So he's quite subject, even being the vicar of Christ, he is subject to many things, namely God himself. And people could say, well, the Word of God, the Bible, is my final authority. They might say, well, whose interpretation of the Bible? As you just look outside, there are thousands of denominations, all with their different take on the Bible, so they don't even agree upon what their one source of authority is or what it teaches. And then again, who put the Bible together in the first place? God didn't write it in heaven and float it down to us. The Catholic Church decided which books are in and which books are out, based on the apostolic teachings. So the schism between the East and West, the Great Schism of 1054, the Eastern Orthodox did not want to subject themselves to the Roman Pontiff, so they left. The Protestant Revolution with Martin Luther, he saw his own understanding of the Bible as being authoritative over that of the Pope and the Magisterium. The French Revolution, really taking it a step further from that, says that human reason, under the guise of the state, not the church, has authority over religious things. And really that's the context of what this episode is about, because this is part 2 of the Syllabus of Errors formulated by Blessed Pope Pius IX. And part 2 really goes in about the struggle of power and authority between the church and the state. Now the state wields power and authority much like what Jesus warned the apostles that the kingdom of God was not about, lording it over others. Even though in the United States, according to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the rights of man come from the Creator, which would be according to natural law, which is actually a Catholic idea. But now, being that the state has become so much larger and oftentimes unilaterally shoving secular laws down the throats of those who dissent, via the courts, they don't really adhere to the Constitution that rights come from the Creator. They claim that rights come from themselves, from the state, which is what the French Revolution more or less put forward anyway. So they can claim all they want that they come from God, but which God? So again, it goes to transcendence or immanence. So let's get into the Syllabus of Errors again. So this is part 2. So last time we did the first 5 sections. This time we'll do sections 6 through 10. Now these, what I'm about to read, these are the errors that are being condemned. These aren't the ideas put forth by the church. And so we do have to decide which governing body has authority one over the other. And a third option, being the individual, is not an option. So it really does come down to this struggle. This is what it's all about. Section 6. Errors concerning civil society viewed both in themselves and in their relations to the church. Error number 39. The state of the Commonwealth, inasmuch as it is the origin and source of all rights, exercises a certain right bound by no limits. Okay, so we can see this here definitely contradicts the idea that rights come from the Creator. And here it says that the origin of all rights comes from the Commonwealth or the state, and it is unlimited. So the state really determines what rights are. And that's just breeding ground for an authoritarian dictator state, right? Error number 40, quote, the doctrine of the Catholic Church is opposed to the good and to the advantages of human society. Okay, so you can see error number 40, that idea is very hostile, pitted against the church, right? Error number 41, quote, to the civil power, even if exercised by an infidel ruler, belongs to the indirect negative power over sacred things, and hence to the same belongs not only the right which is called exequatur, but also the right, as they call it, of appeal as from abuse. Okay, so definitely this is the error that, imagine this kind of language being used today. It says even if it's exercised by an infidel ruler, meaning someone who doesn't have any kind of Christian faith. So still in the context of this debate, it was still presumed that leaders would at least have a generic Christian background, right? Because an infidel in this case, in this context, means someone who's not a Christian, at least generically speaking, right? Error 42, quote, in a conflict between the laws of both powers, the civil law prevails. Close quote, right? So, yeah, it's self-explanatory. That's an error condemned. So, Pius IX there's no confusion, no ambiguity that he views that the church has authority over the state, not the inverse. Error number 43, close quote. Quote, the lay power has authority of rescinding, of declaring, and making void the solemn agreements made with the Apostolic See concerning the use of rights pertaining to the ecclesiastical immunity without its consent, and even against its protest, close quote. Okay, so again here the state is trying to deny ecclesiastical immunity, which means that whatever problems that are existing within the church, even criminal problems, the church has traditionally dealt with its own problems and made judgments and brought the perpetrators to trial, and without any assistance from the state. In severe cases, the church can excommunicate or defrock the cleric, and then they would be subject to the laws of the state. So, but the church has the say-so in that. And that really has to do with the keys given to St. Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So that's not an imaginary thing, because the kingdom of heaven / kingdom of God is both on earth and in heaven. It's not only in heaven. That's why in the Lord's Prayer we say, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Error number 44, quote, "The civil authority can interfere in matters which pertain to religion, morals, and spiritual government. Hence it can judge about the instructions which the pastors of the church, in accordance with their duty, issue as a guide to consciences. Nay, even it can make decrees concerning the administration of the divine sacraments and the dispositions necessary to receive them." Close quote. Now this is really an overstep here. Now, this error believes that the civil authorities have the authority to administer sacraments and even make the guidelines for the proper disposition of the sacraments. That's amazing, right? So that's, for example, the Catholic Church does not permit a person who is in a state of mortal sin to receive communion. So imagine the state coming in and saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Everyone receives communion, no matter if they're an unrepentant rapist, murderer, or whatnot." I mean, and it also goes with the idea that in communist nations, they appoint their own bishops, right? So bishops which answer to them. So that this is definitely a contest. And the communist idea of a state-sanctioned church is the end result of when the church bends the knee to the state. And Pope Pius IX, God bless his soul, is taking the fight to the state. He foresees, these things happening, and these are the ideas that are, he's hearing, and he's nipping it in the bud, as it were, to prevent those things from happening. And unfortunately, these things are happening way too much these days. Now, with the church bending the knee to the state and shutting down in the midst of the COVID-19 scare. Error number 45, quote, "The entire government of the public schools in which the youth of any Christian state is instructed, Episcopal seminaries being accepted for some reason, can and should be assigned to the civil authority, and assigned in such a way, indeed, that for no other authority is the right recognized to interfere in the discipline of the schools, in the system of studies, and the conferring of degrees, and the choice of approval of teachers." Close quote. Now, this is something that would seem foreign to our 21st century ears in the West, because this is exactly what's happened. Virtually all education is the property of the state now. I mean, even parochial schools have to abide by state standards in many ways, which is explicitly condemned here by Pius IX. I mean, this is mind-boggling, right? Because you have to remember, schools and universities are a product of the Catholic Church. You go back to our European roots. The Church built the universities. The Church built the hospitals. But this transfer of power, really beginning with the French Revolution and then in the decades after, has now the Church having very few hospitals and schools under its own jurisdiction, and even so, the state has demanded that these institutions abide by state regulation. So this is an idea that's condemned by Pope Pius IX. So how far have we fallen, indeed? Error number 46. Nay, even in the seminaries themselves, for the clergy, the plan of studies to be followed is subject to the civil authority. Well, that's pretty much, a rap nowadays. The seminaries are infested with modernism, and they voluntarily go after these naturalistic principles of education. So it's very sad. Error number 47, quote, "The best state of civil society demands that the people's schools, which are open to all children of any class of people, and the public institutions in general, which are destined for the teaching of literature and the more exact studies, and for caring for the education of youth, should be exempted from all authority, control, and power of the Church, and be subjected to the full authority of the civil and political power, exactly according to the pleasure of the rulers and standard of current public opinion." Close quote. So imagine this error saying that all curriculum of education is subject to the pleasure of the rulers and the standard of current public opinion. So this is not even based on science. And we see this today in our educational system out here in the West, especially in my lovely state of California, where they teach young children that they might not be male or female, they might be a number of other genders. The power of suggestion, right? And that boys can marry boys, girls can marry girls, and boys can become girls, and vice versa, and it's just madness. This is what happens when God is no longer the foundation of education. Because if God isn't, someone else is going to fill the void, whether it be a naturalistic man or some other worse demonic entity. And this is the slippery slope. Once you get the church out of public life and discourse, it's all downhill from there. And St. Paul kind of gives the example of the pattern of pagan thought in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. Okay, next one. Number 48, quote, "Catholic men can approve that method of instructing youth which has been divorced from Catholic faith and the power of the Church, and which regards only, or at least primarily, the natural sciences and the purposes of social life on earth alone." Close quote. So it's interesting. It goes from the last one where it says the standard, the pleasure of rulers and the standard of current public opinion. Then it kind of throws in some science here. It says that education should be primarily from the natural sciences and the purposes of social life on earth alone. And that's a contradiction. I mean, that's a contradiction in terms itself, the natural sciences and the purposes of social life. Now, science teaches you how things operate on the earth, but science does not give you a purpose of social life. Science has nothing to do with purpose. Purpose is not derived from science, other than what a thing is designed to do in nature. But the purpose of social life, meaning the interaction of humans, is not something that science can determine. That's something that comes from the human mind, which has ambition and purpose given by God. And really it comes from God. God gives the purpose of life, which is namely to love and serve Him, and secondarily to love and serve your neighbor as yourself. That's the purpose of life. Science cannot give you the purpose of life. So this error here is condemned even logically on its own merits. Number 49, quote, "Civil authority can hinder bishops and the faithful people from freely and reciprocally communicating with the Roman Pontiff," close quote. So here this error attempts to drive a wedge between the Roman Pontiff, the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, and the bishops and the faithful. So that's explicitly condemned. So that there's a sinister purpose in these kind of errors, that they want to divide and conquer. They want to divide the church up, split it into even regional jurisdictions. So the bishop doesn't need the Pope's authority to do anything. He's in charge of his own archdiocese or diocese, and he can make his own decisions. Basically, when you do that, then all kinds of divisions and splits and schisms happen within the church. So can't do that. Error number 50. The lay authority has of itself the right of presenting bishops and can compel them to enter upon the administration of their diocese before they receive from the Holy See their canonical appointment and apostolic letters, close quote. So this error is basically a manifestation of democracy or democratic values where the people decide who their leaders are. So, as we've said on this channel before, democracy is the absolute worst form of government. Many people cannot rule simultaneously, and they cannot decide what is best for the common good. Error number 51, quote, moreover, secular government has the right of deposing bishops from the exercise of their pastoral ministry and is not bound to obey the Roman Pontiff in those matters which regard the institution of the episcopates and the bishops, close quote. So this one is continued from the other one. Not only do the error is not only do the people have the right to appoint their own bishops, they also have the right to depose them if they don't like them, without any regard for the Roman Pontiff. So this is an attack on the Pope, that these errors are, on his authority, and it's an attack on hierarchy in general, which goes not only against divine law, but it goes against the natural law, because hierarchies are prevalent in nature and also in the church. Error number 52, quote, the government can by its own right change the age prescribed by the church for religious profession of women as well as of men, and can prescribe for all religious orders that they should not admit anyone to the pronouncement of solemn vows without its permission, close quote. So the state here is saying that whatever the church canon law prescribes for the minimum age of either ordination or religious orders, that the state can lower the age if it so prescribes or makes it higher, and also having to do with solemn vows, that the state has authority over that. Error number 53, quote, the laws which pertain to the protection of the status of religious orders and to their rights and duties should be abrogated. Indeed, the civil government can furnish aid to all those who wish to abandon the institute of the religious life which they once accepted, and to break their solemn vows. And likewise, it can suppress these same religious orders, as well as collegiate churches and simple benefices, even those of the right to patronage, and can lay claim to and subject their property and revenues to the administration and will of the civil power, close quote. So yeah, again, the state, this idea is the state can permit people who don't want to be in religious orders anymore to break their vows and go into public life, and then the state is saying that they will protect them from any discipline of the church, which is, again, it's all about authority. Error number 54, quote, kings and princes are not only exempt from the jurisdiction of the church, but they also are superior to the church in deciding questions of jurisdiction, close quote. So you have to remember, in this time, in the mid-19th century, kings and princes are still in the world, and even so, it would also naturally go to it would apply to governments which are not monarchies, or do not have a royal or an aristocratic rulers. So they're basically saying that the secular rulers are not subject to the church, they're not in their jurisdiction, and even that they're greater. Error number 55, quote, the church is to be separated from the state and the state from the church, close quote. So Pius IX strictly condemns the idea of separation of church and state. So Catholics are bound to this teaching because this is an apostolic decree. It's not a dogma per se, but it is ordinary magisterium, which is to be obeyed. And you can see clearly that there is a struggle of authority going on with these errors which are condemned. Okay, next section, section 7, errors concerning natural and Christian ethics. So we're kind of shifting gears here, but these ideas of ethics fall under the same kind of authority, like who gets to determine which ethics are good and should be obeyed, right? So error number 56, the laws of morals by no means need divine sanction, and there is not the least need that human laws conform to natural law, or receive the power of binding from God, close quote. So you can see this is just wickedness, saying that morals can be decided by the state without any sanction of divine or natural law. So nature doesn't even dictate what's right and what's wrong. So it's, according to this error, it's arbitrarily decided by the state, or they could vote on it, or a judge could say so, and that becomes the standard. So this is an authoritarian dictatorship. That's what this builds up to. Error number 57. Quote, the science of philosophy and of morals, likewise, the civil laws, can and should ignore divine and ecclesiastical authority, close quote. Error number 58. Other powers should not be recognized except those which have their basis in the material, physical side of man, and all moral discipline and honesty should be employed to accumulate and increase wealth in any way whatsoever and to satisfy man's pleasures, close quote. So this is revealing, right? The only laws and powers that should be recognized have their base in the material world. So in other words, atheism, right? And communism, which is centered on atheism, and moral discipline and honesty should be employed to accumulate and increase wealth in any way whatsoever to satisfy man's pleasures. So once you get rid of the divine, once ethics are not subject to divine or sanction or even the natural law, then what is man's end? To accumulate wealth and to satisfy himself with pleasure. So this is, once God is not part of the ethics of society, if your laws are not based on divine sanctions, then what do you have? Wealth and pleasure. And of course, the more wealth you have, the more pleasure you have. And it also says that you should accumulate and increase wealth in any way whatsoever. So this has nothing to do with ethics. There's no ethics to how you accumulate your wealth. And what do we see today? We see the elitists with an abundance of money, and they use their money to rule over the people. That's what's been happening since 1789. Error number 59, quote, right consists in a physical fact. All the duties of men are an empty name, and all human deeds have the force of right, close quote. So this is kind of like a survival of the fittest kind of thing. So a human right consists in a physical fact. So basically the one who has more power over the other, physical power, determines who has the right to give rights to the people. So again, the poor and the weak will be trampled upon in this model. Error number 60, quote, authority is nothing more than numbers and the sum of material strengths, close quote. That's a ditto, same thing. Error number 61, quote, the chance injustice of an act brings no detriment to the sanctity of the right. So whatever injustices might happen according to these rights, which are gained by material power, it doesn't take anything away from the right. So it's bullying, in other words. It's like if injustice happens, oh well, too bad. I guess you weren't strong enough to deal with it. So this just creates massive and widespread injustice, right? It's kind of like slavery in the worst way that we can imagine. Error number 62, quote, the principle of non-intervention must be proclaimed and observed, close quote. So when the strong man exercises his rights over his subjects, non-intervention is the way. So you are not to interfere with the strong man trampling over the weak. That's what that error says. Error number 63, quote, "It is lawful to withhold obedience to legitimate rulers, indeed, even to rebel." So this seems to be somewhat of a contradiction here. But in other words, this is giving the right to revolution. So it's acknowledging that there are such things as legitimate rulers, but the error says that it's lawful to withhold obedience to legitimate rulers and to rebel against them. So this is, Luciferian and satanic in nature, right? To rebel against the establishment. Error number 64, quote, "The violation of any most sacred oath and even any criminal and disgraceful action repugnant to eternal law not only must by no means be reproved, but is even altogether lawful and worthy of the highest praise when it is done for the love of country." Close quote. So here we don't have globalism as the problem. Here we have nationalism being placed above the authority of the church, right? So sacred oaths need not apply, and it says it's even sanctioning criminal and disgraceful actions against the eternal laws, the laws of the church. It says that these are lawful and worthy of the highest praise when it's done for the sake of country. So putting the country or the state above church is in mind here. Okay, next section, section number 8, concerning errors concerning Christian marriage. Because of course, in any functioning society, family is the foundational cornerstone. If you don't have a solid family, you don't have a society. And so in the power struggle of authority, the family is the central piece of the struggle, right? Whoever controls the family controls society. Error number 65. In no way can it be asserted that Christ raised matrimony to the dignity of a sacrament, close quote. So that's an error. So this actually goes against even the Protestant ideas that there are at most 2 sacraments, baptism and communion. So the church has declared 7 sacraments, and matrimony is one of them. And because if it's a sacrament, then it belongs to the church. So if the state is fighting against the church, the state wants marriage to not be a sacrament. It wants it to be a civil affair. Because if it's a sacrament, then divorces are subject to the authority of the church. And even more so, what this has devolved into on the slippery slope model, since marriage is a state of the civil affairs, the state, matters of the state. Now, the state can redefine marriage as between a man and a man, a woman and a woman, and God knows what else might happen in the future with that, since the state has the authority over matrimony. And matrimony also has to do with motherhood and the bearing of children. So the state can then sanction laws like in China, the one-child policy, or depopulation of the earth and population control and other such measures. And then the state can sanction artificial birth control as being a valid practice, of which the church condemns. So this is a big issue. Error number 66, quote, "The sacrament of matrimony is nothing but an appendage to the contract and separable from it, and the sacrament itself consists merely in nuptial blessing," close quote. So, same thing. Error number 67, quote, "By natural law, the bond of matrimony is not indissoluble, and in various cases, divorce, properly so called, can be sanctioned by the civil authority," close quote. And this is a big problem. In today's society in the West, the rate of divorce is 50-50. So you flip a coin when you get married, and that's your chance of divorce, pretty much. And divorces tear apart and split up families. It tears apart and splits up wealth, property, and worst of all, children are psychologically damaged. And they grow up and they bring their psychological baggage into their relationships and into their marriage, and it makes it harder to maintain that marriage. And also proper gender roles, father and mother, male and female, are also broken up. And with the gender roles being watered down and being interchanged, when a single mother has to perform both duties of father and mother, it brings confusion into the children, and they cannot see clearly what a father and a mother are supposed to do in their separate roles. And since the earthly father represents the Father in heaven, God, if he's not there, then the child has even less of an idea of what God is like. So you see, it all goes down from there. This is a satanic attack on the family. Error number 68. Quote, the church does not have the power to establish impediments, nullifying marriage, but that power belongs to civil authority, by which the existing impediments should be removed. Close quote. So this has to do with, because the church sees divorce as a bad thing, although the church does reserve the right to have a marriage annulled if, after proper investigation, it is determined that the marriage was never valid in the first place. For example, if the husband demonstrates that he never meant to fulfill his vows, then the church can determine that, or the wife, the church can determine that the marriage is null and void and was never valid in the first place. And that's not the same thing as a divorce. So the state wants that power. Error number 69, quote, the church in later centuries began to introduce deriment and impediments not by its own right, but by making use of a right which it had borrowed from the civil power, close quote. So this is the claim that the church changed its laws in governing marriages. They got that idea and the power from the civil authorities and usurped it. So this is denying that. Error number 70, quote, the canons of the Council of Trent, which impose the censure of anathema on those who have the boldness to deny the church the power of introducing deriment impediments, are either not dogmatic or are to be understood in accordance with this borrowed power, close quote. So now the church, this error is claiming that the authority of the Council of Trent doesn't have authority over marriage and annulment, and is only to be understood in the context of the civil authority. Error number 71, quote, the formula of the Council of Trent does not oblige under penalty of nullity where the civil law prescribes another formula and wishes to validate a marriage by the intervention of this new formula, close quote. So again, the state wants to nullify the formula of the Council of Trent, and it wants to usurp that authority and be able to have the power of binding and loosing, per se, marriages in the civil courts instead. Error number 72, quote, Pope Boniface VIII was the first to declare that the vow of chastity taken in ordination renders marriages invalid, close quote. So that was a rumor going on that the vow of chastity taken in ordination renders marriages invalid, which is pretty nonsensical, that because a priest has taken a vow of chastity that any marriages he performs are invalid. Error number 73, quote, a true marriage can exist between Christians by virtue of a purely civil contract, and it is false to assert that the contract of marriage between Christians is always a sacrament, or that there is no contract if the sacrament is excluded, close quote. So again, this is the same thing, that marriages can exist by civil authority, which the church has and still to this day denies. So for an example, my own marriage initially was performed in a civil atmosphere. So when I converted to Catholicism, I had to get married again in the church as a sacrament before I could receive the Eucharist, because that's the way the church has always ruled on this. Error number 74, quote, matrimonial cases and betrothals by their very nature belong to the civil court, close quote. So that's more of the same. Okay, section 9, errors concerning the civil power of the Roman Pontiff. So now these errors are going against the Pope. Error number 75, quote, the sons of the Christian and the Catholic Church dispute about the compatibility of the temporal power with the spiritual, close quote. So in the church there is no debate about the temporal power and the spiritual powers, about them being compatible. So you cannot separate the two because we have an incarnational theology. Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh and spirit. So the same way the church has authority over temporal and spiritual matters. Error number 76, quote, the abolition of the civil power which the Apostolic See possesses would be extremely conducive to the liberty and prosperity of the church, close quote. So in other words, if we only got rid of the authority of the Pope, it would greatly contribute to the liberty and prosperity of the church. So, of course, why would the state want there to be a Pope? The state can more easily control the church if it had no Pope, who has unilateral authority according to the keys given by Christ to St. Peter. So a lot of people don't understand. I mean, this is the mentality of virtually all Protestants and non-Catholics alike. They think that the authority of the Pope somehow robs them of liberty and freedom, and that it's some kind of monstrous dictatorship. I mean, in a sense, he is an ecclesial monarchy. But again, if you understand the idea of Christian authority, the authority existing to serve one's subjects in the service and under love and charity, if you understand that correctly, and there's a sense of reciprocity in that, then it's not a problem. But if you have this idea that I have autonomous civil rights apart from any other authority over me, it's the individual saying, you're not the boss of me. I mean, that just goes back to original sin, where the serpent tempted Eve and saying, God doesn't want you to eat this fruit because he knows if you do, you'll become like gods and you'll know right and wrong for yourself. That just goes back to that. So in order to have unity in the church, you need a monarch ruling. You need a man to make the final decision when there is a dispute. Because if you have multiple bishops and multiple patriarchs with equal authority and there's a dispute, the dispute can go on for centuries without any resolve. But if you have a pope, he can lay the law down according to tradition, never contradicting tradition, never making a new doctrine. He can decide what is in accordance with the apostolic doctrine and what is the right action to take. He has that authority. But if you remove that authority, then you have never-ending dispute, and then the state comes in and decides for the church. And the state knows that. The devil knows that, which is why the devil is always trying to attack the see of St. Peter, the chair of the Pope. Okay, last section, almost done. Section 10, errors which are related to modern liberalism. Error number 77. In this age of ours, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be the only religion of the state, to the exclusion of all other cults whatsoever, close quote. Okay, you have to remember the word cult is just a technical term for religious sect. A cult is not necessarily some kind of weirdo making everybody drink Kool-Aid, right? It's not a cult in that sense. You have to remember that. So in other words, it says, in this age of ours, it is no longer expedient that the Catholic religion should be the only religion of the state. You have to remember that virtually the entirety of the European continent was Catholic from the 6th century through the 16th century. And only after the Protestant Revolution did you have states, entire countries being Protestant countries. And then in the case of France and the French Revolution, it became a struggle between Catholic France and secular France. So this error wants there to be many religions of the state, or the freedom of religion, the freedom for the individual to choose which religion he belongs to, and that the state should govern over all of that. So once you have multiple religions in a country that are sanctioned by the state, that gives the state the authority de facto. So that's the problem with that. So once upon a time, you had a united Europe with the civil laws being based upon the laws of Christ, but now you have laws based on secularism, atheism, scientism, and paganism. That's what you have now, ever since you got rid of Catholic rule over the state. Error number 78. Quote, hence, in certain regions of Catholic name, it has been laudably sanctioned by law that men immigrating there be allowed to have public exercises of any form of worship of their own. Close quote. So again, this has to do with religious liberty. So it's saying that people who immigrate from non-Catholic lands to Catholic lands should have the right to worship however they want. So this is a strategy of secularism and of Freemasonry, Luciferianism, that in order to defeat a Christian nation, you just bring in immigrants who are not Christians and give them their own rights. So that's a strategy of divide and conquer. So you can see where the debate of immigration comes in. So if you have, and that's what's happening in Europe right now, you have the wars in the Middle East, so you have all these displaced Mohammedans, Muslims, and they have to have somewhere to live. Since we bombed the hell out of their countries and destroyed their homes, now we have to find them new homes in Western civilizations, in nations that used to be Christian. So we bring thousands of Muslims into European countries, into Canada, into the United States, and now, they should be able to worship however they want. You have that, and then all of a sudden, well, now you have a Muslim majority in this county, they should have the right to impose Sharia law in that region. And then now, since they don't practice contraception, they don't abort their babies, they have 8 babies and can have multiple wives. So let's say they have 3 wives and 8 babies per wife. So now you have 24 offspring of one man, all Muslims, compared to the American or the European who aborts their babies and contracepts, and they might have 1 or 2 children. So guess what happens in a generation or 2? Yeah. So this is the problem with the strategy of immigration to change the religious culture of a region. Error number 79, quote, for it is false that the civil liberty of every cult, and likewise the full power granted to all of manifesting openly and publicly any kind of opinions and ideas, more easily leads to the corruption of the morals and minds of the people, and to the spread of the evil of indifferentism. Close quote. So here you have the idea of freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and freedom of speech, meaning you're proclaiming publicly ideas and opinions, that this does not lead to more corruption of morals and indifferentism towards truth. Obviously that's condemned, because if you have all these different ideas, then people are going to like certain ideas according to their own pleasure, and whatever ideas benefit their own ideas that they want for themselves, rather than looking at something in an abstract way, what is true and what is not, what is good and what is evil, and what has been revealed by God to be good and evil, rather than what I think is good and evil and what serves my own pleasure. So now, once upon a time, you had the problem of being ignorant of truth revealed by God. But now you have the problem of there being so many items on the menu, I don't know what to choose, and I don't have time to do research on all of these ideas. Therefore, I'm just going to choose and select as if I were at a buffet, whatever fits my fancy, whatever suits my fancy, right? So that becomes a problem. And the last error, number 80, quote, the Roman Pontiff can and should reconcile and adapt himself to progress, liberalism, and modern civilization, close quote. So, if you remember from the last episode, Syllabus of Errors Part 1, I'm sorry, this wasn't from the last episode. This was from the episode of Did the Freemasons Achieve Victory in the Vatican II Council? The idea given by the later Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, was the Vatican II was the counter syllabus, and I just read the Syllabus of Errors. So why was the Vatican II Council opened? It was to better adapt the Church to modern civilization. I'm sorry, there was a technical difficulty there. I don't know how much was frozen there. Let me start over again. Error number 80. Last error on the list. Quote, the Roman Pontiff can and should reconcile and adapt himself to progress, liberalism, and the modern civilization, close quote. Now that's a big one. If you remember in the previous episode, which was titled, Did the Freemasons Achieve Victory in the Vatican II Council? I quoted from the then Cardinal Ratzinger that the Vatican II Council is the counter syllabus, and we just read the Syllabus of Errors. So we have to remember, why was the Vatican II Council convened in the first place? It was convened so that the Church could better adapt itself to modern society. So the myth of modern man, as if modern man is different from ancient man or the man of all history, as if he had different problems, as if he were not subject to original sin and was in need of conversion and baptism and salvation. So here we have the idea that the Pope should adapt himself to progress, to progressivism. He should adapt himself to liberalism, and he should adapt to modern civilization. So clearly there was the idea that modern civilization is superior, the result of evolution, and is better and more complex than that which the Church had been known to administer to, so that the Pope should compromise and be subject to progress, liberalism, and modernism. So the Vatican II Council did just that. It opened itself to progress, liberalism, and modernism. All you have to do to realize that fact is do research on all the major players of the Vatican II Council, and we'll do an episode on that in the future. And just realize, look at the Pope today. The Pope is very much a friend of the progressives, the liberals, and of the modernists. There's no denying that. One would have to put his head in the sand like an ostrich to deny that. So, I hope this was revealing to you. This is true Catholic teaching, the Syllabus of Errors. God bless you, and in nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen.